The light that bled over the ragged edge of the Pacific was thin and gray, the color of a gull's underwing. It did little to warm Old Man Hemlock as he stood on the weathered porch of his cabin, a sentinel perched high on the coastal bluffs. The air, sharp with salt and the damp decay of fallen pine needles, was his oldest companion. Below, the ocean breathed its ancient, rhythmic sighs, the sound of waves collapsing onto the jagged rocks, a familiar lullaby that had scored most of his 70-odd years. He raised the heavy, brass-bound binoculars to his eyes, their lenses scarred like his own weathered face. This was his ritual, as ingrained as the tides themselves. His gaze swept the familiar panorama, the dark, brooding headlands to the north, the long, sweeping curve of the bay to the south, and the vast, indifferent expanse of water that stretched to an unseen horizon. Gulls wheeled and cried, their voices sharp counterpoints to the ocean's deep baritone. Today, though, the peace felt precarious. Hemlock, a man whose senses were tuned to the subtle shifts of the natural world more acutely than any barometer, felt it in the marrow of his bones. The tide was running unusually strong, a muscular, insistent pull that clawed at the base of the cliffs with a restless energy. The waves, too, were different, not the lazy rollers of a calm morning, but short, choppy aggressors, their white caps flecked with an agitated foam. The sea seemed to hold its breath, a vast, gray lung tensing before an unknown exertion. He lowered the binoculars, his brow furrowed. His connection to this wild place was not one of ownership, but of quiet, almost grudging reverence. He'd seen its beauty, its fury, its profound indifference. And this morning, the grandeur felt edged with a nascent harshness, a subtle warning whispered on the wind that only a man who truly listened could discern. Something was amiss in the kingdom he only observed. Hemlock's gaze, methodical and patient, continued its sweep. He tracked a distant fishing trawler, a smudge of smoke on the horizon, then a pod of seals, slick and dark on the offshore rocks. It was then, as his binoculars panned across a stretch of particularly turbulent water closer to shore, that he saw it. Not a natural disturbance, not the playful breach of a dolphin or the fleeting shadow of a shark. This was chaos. A violent thrashing erupted, churning the gray water into a furious white froth. It was immense, far too large for any common creature of these shores. He adjusted the focus knob with a sudden, clumsy urgency, his breath catching in his throat. The image sharpened, coalesced, and what he saw punched the air from his lungs. A whale, a humpback, one of the deep ocean titans somehow drawn perilously close to the treacherous inshore currents. But it wasn't just its presence that was shocking, it was its predicament. The magnificent creature was ensnared, a prisoner in its own realm. A horrifying cat's cradle of thick, dark ropes, discarded fishing gear, ghost nets, wrapped around its colossal body. Lines bit cruelly into its blubber, cinching around its powerful pectoral fins, trailing like macabre streamers from its fluke. Its movements were no longer the fluid poetry of a creature at home in the deep, but a series of desperate, weakening lunges against an unyielding enemy. Each labored arch of its back, each convulsive slap of its tail against the surface was a testament to its fading strength. Its blows, when they came, were not the mighty exhalations that could mist the air for miles, but shallow, ragged gasps, punctuated by a sound that carried faintly to Hemlock on the wind, a low, guttural groan of profound distress. A cold fist clamped around Hemlock's heart. He'd seen death in many forms on this coast, storms claiming sailors, predators taking prey, but this was different. This was a slow, agonizing strangulation, a majestic life being choked out by the careless detritus of humankind. A raw, unfamiliar anger, sharp and hot, surged through him, warring with a sickening sense of helplessness. The whale, a symbol of wild, untamed freedom, was being brought low by a tangle of forgotten plastic and nylon, a monument to human negligence. He watched, transfixed by the terrible beauty of its struggle, the dark mass of its body a stark silhouette against the churning, indifferent sea. The uneasy peace of the morning had shattered, replaced by a stark, undeniable horror. The binoculars sagged in Hemlock's trembling hands. For a long moment, he simply stood there, a statue carved from weathered wood in disbelief, the horrific tableau imprinted on his vision. The whale's struggles were becoming more sporadic, interspersed with periods of unnerving stillness. Time, he knew with a sudden, chilling certainty, was a luxury the Titan no longer possessed. The reclusive shell he'd carefully constructed over decades cracked. This wasn't something he could just observe, file away with the other grim spectacles the coast occasionally offered. This demanded action. He turned, his movements stiff but driven by a new, fierce energy, and hurried back into the dim confines of his cabin. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the gloom. On a small, cluttered table sat an ancient rotary phone, its black bakelite dulled with age. He rarely used it. The world outside his bluffs mostly held little interest. But now it was a vital link, a fragile thread of hope. His gnarled fingers, more accustomed to mending nets or whittling wood, fumbled with the dial. He had to consult a faded, handwritten list of numbers tacked to the wall, his eyes squinting in the low light until he found it. Marine Mammal Rescue. He lifted the heavy receiver, the dial tone a surprisingly loud hum in the quiet cabin. He spun the dial, each click a small prayer. The line connected. A calm, professional female voice answered. "Marine Mammal Rescue, how can I help you?" Hemlock cleared his throat, the sound raspy. His own voice, when it finally emerged, was tight, stripped of its usual gruffness, imbued with an urgency that surprised even himself. "There's a whale," he began, the words tumbling out, concise and stark. "Humpback, badly entangled, off Gull Rock Point, about half a mile out, tide's coming in fast. It's not looking good." He provided the details with the precision of a man who knew every cove and current of this coastline like the lines on his own palm. He described the nature of the entanglement, the whale's diminishing strength, the relentless pull of the tide dragging it closer to the jagged, unforgiving rocks. There was no embellishment, no unnecessary sentiment, just the raw, unvarnished truth of a desperate situation. He listened intently to the voice on the other end, nodding occasionally, his gaze fixed on the small, grimy window that offered a sliver of the churning sea beyond. When the call ended, he replaced the receiver with a decisive click. A lifeline had been extended, a fragile beacon lit in the overwhelming darkness of the whale's plight. Now, all he could do was wait and watch, and hope it wasn't already too late. The weight of the Titan's struggle seemed to press down on the small cabin, a silent, desperate plea echoing in the salt-laced air. Miles down the coast, in a low, functional building smelling faintly of brine and diesel, Anya Sharma's head snapped up from the chart she was studying. The clipped, urgent tones coming from Lena, the communications officer, cut through the usual morning bustle of the Marine Mammal Rescue Station. Lena's hand was pressed to her headset, her brow furrowed in concentration as she scribbled notes. "Humpback entanglement, Gull Rock Point," Lena relayed, her voice clear and steady despite the gravity of the information. "Caller states severe, multiple lines, animal weakening, incoming tide critical." Anya was already moving. The professional calm she cultivated in these moments was a thin veneer over a fierce, coiled energy. "Gull Rock, that's a nasty spot, especially on an incoming tide," she said, her mind instantly visualizing the treacherous currents and submerged hazards. "Jake." A burly man with sun-bleached hair and hands calloused from years of handling boats and heavy gear looked up from coiling a rope. Jake was their most experienced boat handler, his instincts on the water almost as keen as Hemlock's. "On it, Anya," he responded, already striding towards the equipment lockers. The small station, usually a place of methodical preparation and research, transformed into a hive of focused activity. Anya grabbed a waterproof bag containing her personal rescue kit, specialized knives, disentanglement tools with varying pole lengths, sedative injectors, a last resort, and a small ruggedized camera to document the situation. Lena continued to gather more details from Hemlock, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the rising tension. "He says it's a mature adult, looks exhausted," Lena reported, glancing up. "The caller sounds like he knows his stuff, very specific about the location and the gear involved, heavy fishing nets, thick polypropylene ropes." Anya nodded grimly. Ghost gear, the worst. Within minutes, they were a blur of purposeful motion. Heavy-duty cutting tools were checked and loaded. Buoys, designed to help lift tangled gear or mark a whale's position, were stacked. A small inflatable Zodiac, crucial for close quarters work, was prepped. The air thrummed with a controlled urgency, each member of the small team knowing their role, their movements practiced and efficient. The weight of responsibility settled on Anya's shoulders. The life of a magnificent creature and the safety of her team rested on the decisions she would make in the coming hours. They moved out to the dock where the Guardian, their sturdy, well-equipped rescue vessel, bobbed gently. Jake fired up the powerful twin engines, their throaty roar shattering the morning quiet. Anya did a final check of their restraints and safety lines. As the Guardian pulled away from the dock, carving a clean white wake through the choppy harbor water, Anya took a deep breath. She glanced back at the receding shoreline, then out towards the open sea, her gaze already fixed on the distant, hazy outline of Gull Rock Point. The race against time and tide had begun. The Guardian sliced through the increasingly agitated water, the spray misting over the bow. Anya stood braced against the console, her binoculars fixed on the churning patch of white water that Hemlock had described. Even from a distance, the scene was alarmingly clear. The whale, a dark, immense shape against the gray, was no longer thrashing with the wild panic of its initial entrapment. Its movements were now sluggish, almost defeated, punctuated by labored, shallow blows that barely cleared the surface. As they drew closer, the true scale of the tragedy unfurled before them. The humpback was colossal, a living mountain of flesh and bone, dwarfing their rescue vessel. And the entanglement? It was a monstrous, suffocating web. Thick, barnacle-encrusted ropes, the ghostly remnants of lost fishing nets, were cinched around its body like a perverse harness. One heavy line was wrapped tight around its fluke, rendering its most powerful tool for propulsion and defense almost useless. Another had sawed deeply into the sensitive skin near its pectoral fin, leaving a raw, angry gash. Strands of finer netting fanned out, tangling with each other, creating a deadly, unyielding trap. A low, mournful sound, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to vibrate through the hull of the Guardian, rumbled across the water. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering, and it struck Anya to her core. This wasn't just an animal in distress. It was a sentient being, aware of its terrifying predicament, its life ebbing away with each futile struggle. Jake expertly maneuvered the boat, keeping a respectful but effective distance, assessing the currents that were now aggressively pushing the whale towards a wicked outcrop of submerged rocks. "Tide's really ripping here, Anya," he called out, his voice tight. "We don't have a lot of room to play." Anya nodded, her face grim. She could see the rocks, dark and menacing, waiting. The whale was being inexorably drawn towards them. Lena, her voice quiet, relayed, "Caller on the cliffs confirms it's getting weaker. He's been watching." Anya raised her own binoculars, scanning the distant bluffs. She could just make out a tiny, solitary figure. Old Man Hemlock, a silent, anxious witness to the unfolding drama. His presence, his earlier call, was a small comfort, a reminder that someone else cared deeply. But the sight before her was overwhelming. The sheer mass of the whale, the complexity of the entanglement, the relentless power of the ocean, it was a daunting trifecta. The air was thick with the smell of salt, diesel, and a faint, sickly sweet odor that Anya recognized with a pang, the smell of stressed whale. Hope, which had burned bright during their rapid mobilization, now felt like a fragile ember, threatened by the immensity of the challenge. The Titan was truly in peril, and the clock was ticking with terrifying speed.
"Okay, Jake, let's get the Zodiac in," Anya commanded, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind and waves. This close, the whale's labored breathing was a harsh, rasping sound, each exhalation a visible plume of mist tinged with exhaustion. The sheer power still latent in that massive body, even weakened, was palpable. Jake, with practiced efficiency, worked with Lena to deploy the smaller, more maneuverable inflatable craft. It slapped onto the choppy water, bucking like an untamed colt. Anya, already clad in her waterproof gear and a life vest, checked the security of her harness one last time before carefully climbing down into the Zodiac. Jake followed, taking the tiller. The small boat felt terrifyingly vulnerable as Jake skillfully navigated it closer to the beleaguered giant. Waves, whipped up by the wind and the strong tidal current, crashed over the Zodiac's bow, drenching them in cold, salty spray. The whale, sensing their approach, reacted with a sudden, convulsive surge. Its massive head, scarred and festooned with barnacles, lifted partially from the water, its one visible eye, large, dark, and seemingly fathomless, rolling wildly. It let out another of those heart-wrenching groans, a sound that spoke of terror and unimaginable pain. The water around them churned into a maelstrom as the whale thrashed, its immense tail fluke, though partially bound, slapping the surface with a force that sent geysers of water high into the air. The Zodiac pitched violently, threatening to capsize. Anya gripped the safety ropes, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the tangled mess. She could see now how deeply some of the ropes had cut, the flesh around them swollen and inflamed. "Easy, easy," Jake muttered, his voice calm but strained, wrestling with the tiller to keep them from being swept into the whale or onto the nearby rocks. He was performing a delicate, dangerous dance, trying to get Anya close enough to assess and begin cutting, while simultaneously avoiding the desperate, unpredictable movements of a creature weighing many tons. Anya, despite the chaos, forced herself to breathe deeply, to analyze. The primary lines constricting its fluke were the most critical, but also the most dangerous to approach. Any sudden movement there could be lethal. She needed to start with the looser, more accessible lines around its torso, hoping to alleviate some pressure, perhaps even calm it slightly. Each time Jake edged the Zodiac closer, the whale would react, a fresh wave of panic rippling through its enormous frame. The air was thick with tension, the roar of the ocean, and the whale's agonized sounds. It was a perilous ballet of human intent and animal desperation, played out on a stage of wind-whipped water with the jagged rocks waiting patiently in the wings. Hemlock, a distant, powerless spectator, could only watch as the tiny boat and its occupants risked everything to reach the ensnared Leviathan. "Hold her steady, Jake. I'm going for that one on the dorsal ridge," Anya shouted over the wind, pointing with a gloved hand to a thick green polypropylene rope that was cinched cruelly across the whale's back just behind its blowhole. It seemed a slightly less perilous starting point. Jake, his face a mask of concentration, maneuvered the Zodiac with breathtaking skill. He brought them alongside the whale's immense flank, so close Anya could smell the creature's breath, a fishy, primal scent mixed with the metallic tang of its stress. The sheer scale of the animal beside them was humbling, its skin a landscape of scars, barnacles, and the raw, chafed wounds from the ropes. Anya extended a long pole, at its end a specially designed hooked blade. The boat pitched and yawed, making precision difficult. The whale tensed, a tremor running through its body. Anya held her breath, timing her movement with a brief lull in the waves. With a grunt of effort, she hooked the blade under the taut rope and pulled. The blade bit. There was a sharp snap as the polypropylene parted. The tension on that particular line vanished, and a section of heavy netting sagged away from the whale's body. A small victory, but a palpable one. Anya felt a surge of adrenaline, a tiny flicker of hope igniting in the oppressive gloom of the situation. "Got one!" she yelled, a triumphant edge to her voice. But the ocean and the whale were not about to make it easy. As if startled by the sudden release, or perhaps by the sting of the now loosened rope scraping against its raw skin, the whale gave a sudden, powerful shudder. Its massive body rolled, creating a wave that slammed into the Zodiac, threatening to swamp it. Simultaneously, a trailing section of the newly cut rope, heavy and waterlogged, whipped through the air like a monstrous bullwhip. Anya ducked instinctively, the rope hissing inches above her head with a force that would have been devastating. Cold water cascaded over her, and she tasted salt and fear. Jake swore under his breath, fighting to regain control as the Zodiac spun precariously. "Too close," he yelled, his voice strained. "That could have taken your head off, Anya." Shaken but undeterred, Anya wiped the water from her face. "I'm okay. Let's try the one near the pectoral fin." Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a stark reminder of the razor-thin margin between success and disaster. Each cut was a gamble, a small piece of freedom offered at great personal risk. The whale was still a wild, powerful animal, its reactions born of pain and terror, not malice. And with every passing minute, the tide crept higher, pushing them all closer to the unforgiving rocks. The taste of danger was sharp and metallic, a constant companion to the fragile bloom of hope. Hours crawled by, measured in the rhythmic crash of waves, the strained groans of the whale, and the sharp, decisive snaps of Anya's cutting tools. The initial adrenaline had given way to a weary, dogged determination. Anya and Jake were soaked to the bone, their muscles aching from the constant battle against the relentless motion of the sea and the sheer physical effort of the rescue. Their faces were etched with fatigue and the salt spray that crusted their eyelashes. They had managed to sever several more lines. Loops of heavy netting and thick ropes now trailed loosely in the water, no longer biting so cruelly into the whale's flesh. But the most critical entanglement remained, a complex Gordian knot of thick, braided rope wrapped with suffocating tightness around the whale's massive fluke. This was the anchor holding it captive, the primary source of its inability to propel itself to safety. The whale's struggles had diminished significantly. The violent thrashing had subsided, replaced by slow, weary shudders that rippled through its immense frame. Its blows were infrequent now, shallow and weak, each one sounding like a painful sigh of resignation. Its great eye, when visible, was half closed, filmed over with an exhaustion so profound it was heartbreaking to witness. It seemed to be conserving its last vestiges of energy, perhaps sensing the futility of fighting the unyielding lines and the encroaching rocks. "It's fading, Anya," Jake said, his voice low and grave, his gaze fixed on the almost inert giant. "We're running out of time. That fluke tangle is the killer." Anya knew he was right. The tide was nearing its peak, and the whale was now dangerously close to the jagged teeth of the submerged reef. With each surge of water, its massive body scraped against the unseen rocks below, a dull, sickening thud that resonated through the Zodiac. The sun, a pale disk in the gray sky, had begun its slow descent, casting long, ominous shadows. The complexity of the knot around the fluke was daunting. It was a dense, multi-layered snarl, pulled incredibly tight by the whale's earlier desperate struggles. From the Zodiac, even with the longest pole, Anya couldn't get the right angle or leverage to sever the deeply embedded lines without risking further injury to the whale or snapping her tools. The Titan lay there, a magnificent creature brought to the brink, its fate hanging precariously on this one, deeply entrenched tangle. The weight of its life, the sheer impossibility of the task ahead, pressed down on Anya with suffocating force. Anya stared at the tangled fluke, her mind racing. The Zodiac, even with Jake's masterful handling, was too unstable, too buffeted by the waves to allow for the delicate, forceful work needed. Every failed attempt with the long-poled cutters risked agitating the whale further, or worse, driving the ropes even deeper into its flesh. The rocks were now mere feet away, their dark, menacing shapes visible just beneath the churning surface. They were out of options from the boat. A profound silence settled between Anya and Jake, broken only by the harsh rasp of the whale's breathing and the relentless roar of the surf. The decision, when it came to Anya, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitable, terrifying necessity. "I have to go in," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the ambient noise. Jake turned, his eyes wide with alarm. "Anya, no, it's too dangerous. One flick of that fluke, even accidentally." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew the catastrophic power contained in that massive appendage. "There's no other way, Jake," she insisted, already unclipping a shorter, more robust cutting tool from her belt. "We can't reach it from here. It's too weak to help us. If we don't free that fluke now, the tide will finish it on those rocks." Her gaze was unwavering, a mixture of grim determination and a deep, empathetic sorrow for the creature's plight. She secured her safety tether to a cleat on the Zodiac, a thin line that felt laughably inadequate against the power of the ocean and the potential force of the whale. She checked the canister of compressed air for her emergency buoyancy device. Then, without another word, before Jake could argue further, she took a deep breath and slipped over the side of the Zodiac into the shockingly cold, turbulent water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath for a moment. The world transformed. Above, the gray sky and the anxious face of Jake. Below, the murky, churning water, the immense, dark bulk of the whale, and the terrifying proximity of the rocks. The sound was different too, a muffled roar, punctuated by the creak and groan of the ropes as the whale shifted almost imperceptibly. She kicked towards the ensnared fluke, fighting the strong current that tried to drag her away. The water was clouded with sediment stirred up by the whale's movements and the crashing waves. Visibility was poor. As she drew closer, the sheer size of the fluke was awe-inspiring, wider than she was tall. The ropes were embedded deep, like cruel brands. Her world narrowed to the task at hand, the feel of the cold, rough rope in her gloved hands, the rhythmic, labored sigh of the whale's breathing just feet away, the frantic thumping of her own heart against her ribs. She positioned the cutter, its sharp blade glinting dully in the underwater gloom. She was acutely aware of the immense weight and power mere inches from her, of the fact that a single reflexive twitch from the exhausted animal could crush her, end her. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but a deeper, more powerful instinct to save this creature drove her on. This was the heart-stopping moment, the desperate gamble upon which everything hinged. Anya pressed the blades of the cutter against the thickest, most deeply embedded rope. It was slick with algae and incredibly taut, resisting her initial efforts. She repositioned, bracing herself against the gentle, almost imperceptible sway of the whale's massive tail. The water swirled around her, cold and disorienting. She could feel the faint vibrations of the whale's exhausted body through the water, a subtle tremor that spoke of its ebbing life force. She squeezed the handles of the cutter with all her strength, her muscles burning, her lungs aching for air despite the snorkel. The rope was stubborn, almost unyielding. For a horrifying second, she feared it wouldn't give, that this last, desperate gamble would fail. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her focus. Then, with a sudden, jarring thwack that she felt more than heard, the first thick strand parted. Encouraged, she attacked the next and then the next. Each severance was a small, hard-won victory. The rope, thick as a man's wrist, was made of multiple interwoven strands. She worked with a frantic, focused intensity, sawing and wrenching, oblivious to the cold, the danger, the burning in her arms. The whale remained eerily still, as if sensing, even in its profound exhaustion, that this human intrusion was different, a desperate attempt at liberation rather than further harm. Finally, only one major strand remained, twisted tight like a hangman's noose. It was the core of the knot, the linchpin of the whale's captivity. Anya took a precious second to reposition, drawing a ragged breath through her snorkel. She locked the cutter onto the final rope, gathered all her remaining strength, and squeezed. The fibers groaned, stretched, and then, with a sudden explosive release, snapped. The heavy, waterlogged mass of netting and rope sagged, then began to drift away from the fluke, carried by the current. For a breathless, suspended moment, nothing happened. The whale lay utterly still, a dark, silent behemoth in the murky water. Anya, treading water, her limbs heavy with exertion, her body numb with cold, looked up towards the surface, her face a mask of exhaustion and desperate, unbearable hope. Had they been too late? Had the Titan finally succumbed? The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the relentless crash of waves against the nearby rocks, and Jake's anxious voice calling her name from the zodiac, a sound that seemed to come from a great distance. The world held its breath. The stillness was agonizing. Anya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, terrifying quiet. Had all their effort, all the risk, been for nothing? The immense, dark form beside her remained inert, a colossal monument to a life perhaps already lost. Then, a subtle shift. A tremor ran through the whale's massive body, not of pain or struggle, but something else, a gathering, a stirring from the depths of its exhaustion. Slowly, almost tentatively, the great fluke, now unburdened, flexed. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but to Anya, it was a thunderclap. A moment later, the whale's enormous head began to rise. It broke the surface with a gentle surge, water cascading off its scarred skin. And then it happened. Puff! The sound was magnificent, a sound Anya had longed to hear for hours. A deep, powerful, resonant blow, a geyser of mist and expelled air erupting from its blowhole, spraying high into the gray sky. It was a sound of profound relief, of life asserting itself against the encroaching darkness. It was the sound of freedom. The whale took another breath, then another, each one stronger, deeper than the last. It lay on the surface for a long moment, as if reacquainting itself with the simple act of untethered breathing, of feeling the ocean currents without the cruel bite of ropes. Its massive eye, no longer filmed with exhaustion and terror, seemed clearer, more focused. Anya, still treading water, felt tears, hot and unexpected, sting her eyes, mingling with the cold salt water on her face. A sob, choked with relief and exhaustion, escaped her. Jake, in the zodiac, let out a whoop of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed across the water. "You did it, Anya! You magnificent, crazy woman! You did it!" he yelled, his voice thick with emotion. Even from this distance, Anya could see the tension drain from his shoulders. The oppressive weight that had hung over them for hours lifted, replaced by an almost giddy lightness. Life, tenacious and resilient, had been renewed. The Titan, pulled back from the very brink, was breathing free. The humpback lingered near the surface, its great body rising and falling with each powerful, cleansing breath. It seemed to be gathering its strength, reorienting itself to a world suddenly devoid of constriction and pain. The harsh, jagged rocks, which moments before had seemed an inevitable tomb, were now just part of the coastline it could actively avoid. Slowly, with a grace that belied its immense size and recent ordeal, the whale began to move. Its newly freed fluke pushed against the water, not with the desperate thrashing of before, but with a measured, purposeful beat. It began to swim, not directly away, but in a wide, slow circle that brought it surprisingly close to the zodiac. Anya, still in the water, found herself almost face to face with the whale's enormous eye. It was dark, ancient, and filled with an intelligence that felt profound and unfathomable. For a long, timeless moment, it seemed to hold her gaze.
There was no fear in it now, no panic. Was it curiosity, recognition, or was Anya, exhausted and emotionally raw, simply projecting her own desperate hope for connection onto the creature? She couldn't say. But in that moment, the vast gulf between human and whale felt infinitesimally small. The whale completed its circle, its massive form gliding silently through the water like a submerged continent. Then, with a final, almost leisurely flick of its powerful fluke, it arched its back and dove. Not a panicked, shallow dive, but a deep, confident descent, its body disappearing into the gray-green depths, leaving only a widening, smooth patch of water, its footprint on the turbulent surface. Anya and Jake watched, breathless. Seconds later, further out, towards the open, deeper ocean, the whale breached. Its colossal body launched clear of the water in a spectacular display of power and reclaimed freedom before crashing back down with a thunderous splash that echoed across the bay. It breached again, and then again, each leap taking it further from the treacherous shore, a magnificent silhouette against the darkening horizon. "Well, I'll be," Jake murmured, a note of awe in his voice. "If that wasn't a thank you, I don't know what is." Anya smiled, a genuine, bone-weary smile. Whether it was a conscious expression of gratitude or simply the joyous exuberance of a creature suddenly unshackled, it didn't matter. The Titan was free, heading back to its own world, a wild, untamed spirit returned to the deep. And for Anya, that was thanks enough. As the last distant splash of the departing whale faded into the vastness of the Pacific, a profound quiet settled over the rescuers, broken only by the lapping of waves against the zodiac and the distant cry of a gull. Anya, still treading water, felt the bone-deep chill seep back into her limbs now that the adrenaline had subsided. Jake carefully maneuvered the zodiac closer and helped her aboard, his strong hand steadying her as she clambered in, shivering and utterly spent. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, concern etched on his face. Anya nodded, pulling off her snorkel and mask. "Just tired and cold." But beneath the exhaustion, a deep, resonant satisfaction warmed her. Together, they began the grim task of collecting the discarded fishing gear, the heavy, tangled mass of ropes and netting that had nearly claimed the Titan's life. It was a sobering reminder of the constant threat human carelessness posed to the ocean's inhabitants. Each piece they pulled from the water felt like a small act of atonement. High on the bluffs, Old Man Hemlock lowered his ancient binoculars. His weathered face, usually set in lines of stoic indifference, was unreadable for a moment. Then, a slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. He'd seen the whale breach, seen its powerful, joyful departure. He'd witnessed the small boat and its tenacious occupants achieve what had seemed impossible. He watched as the Guardian and the Zodiac began their slow journey back towards the harbor, leaving the turbulent waters off Gull Rock Point to settle under the fading light. He turned, the cabin door creaking as he entered, the world outside feeling a little less burdened, a fraction lighter than it had at dawn. Aboard the Guardian, as they headed for home, Lena handed Anya a steaming mug of tea. The warmth seeped into her chilled hands. The team was quiet, each lost in their own reflections. The image of the whale's eye, the feel of the ropes, the sheer, terrifying power of the creature, and the incredible relief of its freedom. These sensations would linger. The ocean, now beginning to calm as the tide turned, stretched out around them, vast and mysterious. It had almost claimed one of its own, but today, for this one magnificent animal, human intervention had tipped the scales back towards life. The echoes of the Titan's struggle and its triumphant release would resonate in their memories for a long time to come. Days later, the ache in Anya's muscles had faded, but the memory of the Tangled Titan remained vivid, etched into her mind with the clarity of a freshly developed photograph. She sat at her desk in the quiet of the rescue station, the scent of antiseptic and old charts a familiar comfort. Before her lay the official report, its neat lines and scientific terminology a stark contrast to the raw, visceral experience of the rescue. Species, Megaptera novae Anglia. Condition upon arrival,
severe entanglement, exhaustion. Outcome, successful release. Clinical words for a profoundly emotional event. Her gaze drifted to a large framed photograph on the wall, a humpback whale in mid-breach, captured in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Before, it had been an inspiring image, a symbol of the creature she had dedicated her life to protecting. Now it felt personal. She could almost feel the cold sting of the Pacific spray on her face, the terrifying weight of the whale's body so close, the rough chafe of the ropes under her gloved fingers. She remembered the heart-stopping moment of the final cut, the agonizing stillness, and then that glorious, life-affirming blow. The encounter had reaffirmed her purpose, but it had also subtly shifted her perspective. It wasn't just about the science, the data, or the procedural success of a rescue anymore. It was about the fragile, tenacious spark of life in every creature, the shared vulnerability that connected them all, human and animal. It was about the profound impact, both destructive and redemptive, that her own species had on the planet. The carelessness that had ensnared the Titan was a dark reflection, but the perseverance, the courage, the sheer stubborn refusal to give up displayed by her team and even by Old Man Hemlock with his crucial call was a beacon. Anya picked up a piece of the thick, green polypropylene rope they had recovered, its fibers still stiff with salt. It felt heavy in her hand, a tangible reminder of the unseen dangers lurking beneath the waves. But it was also a reminder of what could be overcome. The lingering lesson wasn't just about the whale. It was about the resilience of the human spirit when faced with a seemingly insurmountable task, the profound connection that could be forged in a moment of shared crisis, and the quiet, powerful hope that bloomed when compassion met action. Every effort, she knew with a deeper certainty than ever before, no matter how daunting, mattered. The ocean was vast, its challenges immense, but today she felt a renewed determination, a quiet strength drawn from the memory of a giant set free, and the knowledge that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one act of focused, unwavering care could indeed change the world. One life at a time.